So I just want to thank you all once again for welcoming me to be back with you. And part of what I'll be talking about is this notion of art as a form of activism. And I hinted on this a little bit yesterday during the masterclass, but I do see some faces that were not in that room. So we'll go into some familiar spaces, but we'll end on a story or an experience that perhaps will provoke some conversation afterwards. So I am what's called a social impact designer. I am both a communications designer as well as a social worker. And I get to travel all across the nation talking about the complexities of our work as artists, as creators, and how they meet different social issues in our communities. Because of a lot of those experiences, I am also an organizer and an activist. I live in St. Louis, Missouri. And if you are familiar with some of the uprisings that have been happening over the last few years, our city in Ferguson, Missouri, which is about 10 minutes away from our downtown area, have been at the foundation of a lot of the current movements that are happening across the nation. But I'm also just like an everyday person. Like I nerd out as a YouTuber and create tutorials and talk about sticky notes all the time on the internet. All of these things make me me. And when it comes to a lot of the work that I do, I really like to look at it on the spectrum of what does it mean for art to engage critically in communities and within the built environment? If you were in yesterday's master class, you may have heard me talk about a few of these projects. We're not going to go into every single one of them, but I do encourage you to go online, check me out, and let's have a conversation as you read and engage with even more of these works. Because my work really does look at those interventions within the built environment, the ways in which we as people navigate and engage with each other, but also come into conflict with each other. And using art and organizing people through a collective called the Artivist STL, we really create these different types of experiences all across our city and across the nation with others to engage, to critique, to speculate what possibilities are being avoided in many ways, and what can we instigate, what can we innovate in order to make this world a little bit better. A lot of that also goes into retelling the narratives of people who have been harmed in communities and harmed by the ways in which media misrepresents and or doesn't cover the full narrative of who they are as people. So some of these works are super, super core to my life and my journey. One of the works that I want to talk about, however, is the Mira Casket, this piece. It was created in 2014 in the midst of a lot of the uprisings and protests that were happening. And it came from a series of nightmares that I was having as a protester in Ferguson. And my dream that I kept having was literally of just random men carrying this casket made out of mirrors. And I couldn't shake the image out of my head, so I called up a bunch of artists to help me build this thing and activate it along our streets. After its first night in Ferguson, it was marched from where Michael Brown was murdered in on Canfield Drive all the way to the police department. And then throughout subsequent marches, protests, activations throughout the city, it was marched and carried elsewhere as well. Eventually, it got to a point where it was being utilized on a national scale as an artistic piece. We didn't create it as an artwork that would be exhibited, but that's what it became once people like Dr. Angela Davis wrote about it and people started to feature it in certain books that were about this particular movement. Ultimately, it was collected by this museum. Does anyone know what this museum is? All right, a few heads. This is the National Museum for African American History and Culture that is in Washington, D.C. It's one of the newest Smithsonian museums. Took 100 years to make it, and they collected our Mira Casket as a way of building a bridge in the narrative between the current civil rights movement that was happening and sparking in Ferguson, and the civil rights movement that in many ways was founded after the death of, or the murder of Emmett Till. So they had their casket, and they wanted this casket as well in order to share and build on that narrative. As this process was happening, as the Mira Casket piece was being collected, there was something else that was happening in my life that was very traumatic, and that's what I want to talk about. So we're going to hold this piece and talk more so about this show. Have any of you heard of the artist Kelly Walker? No? Okay. During the same time that my work, the Mira Casket, was being collected by the Smithsonian, literally the month that that museum opened in DC, my team and I were welcome to travel to DC, be a part of different talks about our art. And at that same time, I was working at the Contemporary Art Museum in St. Louis as both an art educator and a community engagement specialist. During that fall season, the museum allowed for this artist, Kelly Walker, to have a solo exhibition that filled all of the galleries across the museum. His works are indeed controversial. And in the context of a post-Ferguson St. Louis, it really came to its head. This image that you see is one of his pieces called Aquafresh plus Crest, with whitening expressions. And it was a series of works that showed the images of Black women in hip hop on these magazine covers that were then silk screened with Aquafresh and Crest toothpaste on top of them, layered on top of them. By having this image, which was a men's, like a gentleman's magazine that would typically be in, who knows where they'll be actually. I don't own them, I don't know where they would be. But the smears that the toothpaste start to create really makes this image that irks, that unmoves people, because it can look like byproducts of our bodies, in particular semen. In addition to pieces like this one, which went ceiling to floor and then scatter even more on the floor, there were also these series of works called the Black Star Press. And you can't really see it in this image, but each of these three images in this triptych are archival images of Black men during the civil rights movement in 1964, I believe, being attacked by a white police officer and a police dog. On top of these images, which have been rotated 90 degrees, there is milk chocolate, white chocolate, and dark chocolate that have been smeared all over it, to the point where some of the dark chocolate starts to look like blood spatters. When this work of art was being exhibited across the entire museum, as a team member, I had a lot of backlash about this. But it was during the opening weekend and the artist talk that followed that many in our public, in our community, started to contest what was on these walls. And ultimately, just to make the story short, what ended up happening was that there were major protests, there was a boycott, and as a staff member, I wrote an open letter to the directors that was published in Hyperallergic magazine. Once this letter went out into the public, there were people who were learning about more of my works, including this project, which is called the Sticky Note to Self Project. And being inspired as a woman by this work of art, several women largely led by women of color who had not really participated in the museum. They came into the museum space and covered all of the walls with sticky notes, with questions to the directors and to the curators to critique and to probe why, like just the sheer foundation of why. And I tell this story because as an artist, there's a part of me that doesn't necessarily want to support the censorship of another artist. And at the same time, as an art administrator and as an artist and as a community member, had to really get into those tough spots to stand on the side of community members who were offended by these works, but also be a facilitator in that process. And so I wanted to share this part of the story to have a conversation with you, more so about how do we wrestle with those moments of tension? What are the roles of artists to be responsible and hold each other accountable? And how do we navigate within and across and around, sometimes as outsiders to institutions, to make sure that there is less harm being done within communities? How do we hold ourselves collectively responsible? Before we get to that, because I'm watching our time, I just want to tell you some of the happy thoughts that follow this. One was that the museum eventually fired the curator. Actually, he resigned. The curator resigned, moved to Canada. They hired a new chief curator who is a woman of color, who has held the museum accountable to really centering, dignifying stories and narratives in art exhibitions that really honor women and people of color and queer artists. But as it relates to my own story of this, I resigned from the museum, went back into my field as a designer, as a communication and social practice designer. Now I am one of the main designers on a greenway design that is being built. It's a 5-mile radius in our city that is being built to stretch from the St. Louis Arch all the way to Forest Park and serve as a way of weaving some of the areas of our city that have been most segmented or is segregated. In addition to that, because of my work at that museum, the fact that that sculpture was collected by the Blacksonian in DC, I'm also one of the leaders who've been selected to help revitalize the Griot Museum of African American History and Culture in St. Louis. This is the oldest museum in our city. It started in 1997 as a wax museum, but like the area that surrounds it, it has suffered through a lot of disinvestment, a lot of social disinterest, and there's a coalition of people who have had those types of museum experiences who are saying, hey, we're gonna stand together and bring this thing back and really help it be that anchor institution that our city needs to tell those fuller narratives about who we are and what we've gone through over these last few years. And so I leave you at that. I think we may have time for 1 or 2 questions, but I really want to hear your thoughts about, what are our responsibilities to hold ourselves accountable to doing well by community, to being more harmonious and less harmful? Thank you.